Well, the scene was breathtaking. There were over 100,000 people gathered together. We all joined our voices together in singing, in shouting, in praising. It was energetic, and it's not just that we were there just watching. We were participating. We were a part of what was happening, and it was the most breathtaking experience. And as we gathered together, we all came together. It should have been a place of division, all the things that should have separated us, but we came together. There were people that were young and old, rich and poor. There were people that were black and white, popular, unpopular, and we all came together unified as one because we all had the same object of devotion. Is the Crimson Tide football team at the University of Alabama. Sorry, Jonathan, I had to show the other side. And I know some of you Auburn fans are like, get that off the screen. Listen, Haley and I have been there several times. We were there in 2010 for you Auburn fans when Cam Newton led the second half comeback. It's one of the most heartbreaking times in my life. And I remember in 2013, that infamous moment, I don't even like to utter it, that awful time called the kick six. That really pains my heart to even say. I was watching the game with my father-in-law, who's an Auburn fan, and he was gracious enough to not rub it in. And I may or may not have shattered my phone after that play. And it was at that moment, I'm not joking, it was in that moment that I had this realization, is it possible that I have moved from fandom to devotion? And in that moment, I started to, in my heart, if you love football, I do too. I'm not preaching on college football. I'm just using it as an illustration. For me, it was a moment where I realized I might be in this a little too much. What I want us to think about today as we're going through this series in the book of Daniel is the topic of worship, because I think it's a really important topic for us to consider. Let's start out with that question, what is worship? And I know that we've been going through this experience together this morning called worship, but what is worship? Well, it's an idea that comes from an Old English word, worthship, which means basically it's something that is worthy of your time. It's worthy of your heart and your devotion. In the Bible, this word worship carries with it an image of bowing down or bending yourself over towards someone else to give them precedence, to show their importance. It means to pay homage. It means to express adoration and praise. It means to give over the affections of your heart. It's why it's such an important topic in the Bible, because God is after our worship. But God also knows that there's a lot of other things and people and things that we get caught up in that are after our devotion. And here's what I want you to realize this morning. Maybe you've never thought about this, but everyone worships something. Everyone. Christians worship, atheists worship, agnostics worship, Muslims worship, people that go to church worship, people that don't go to church worship. Your next door neighbor worships, your boss, your coworker, they worship. Every person you see at the store worships something, because we were created to worship. There's something within us that has this desire to render allegiance. Whether we're doing it consciously or subconsciously, we're turning over the allegiance of our heart to something. We were created to praise, and you see it when you go through something exciting, you can't wait to share it. And then you realize that there's these things that come up in your life, a lot of good things that grab at your heart and they're pulling your heart, and you go all in. You say things like, I'm just really passionate about this. And passion can, if it's not controlled, lead to an expression of worship, because there's so many things after our hearts. So the question is not, do you worship? That's not the right question. The question is, what do you worship? So we've been in this series in the book of Daniel, and today we're back in chapter 3. We started there last week thinking about these three guys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and we talked about the different trials that we find ourselves in, how sometimes God delivers his people from the fire, but sometimes he doesn't, but he's always present in the fire. But I want us to think today about the other aspect of this story that's going on, where Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego find themselves in a really precarious situation, because here they are, they've been exiled from Jerusalem back to Babylon, and they've been in Babylon for a little while, and things seem be going pretty good. There's been some challenges along the way, but things have kind of calmed down, and they're going along until all of a sudden there's this 90-foot tall statue that is built. And then King Nebuchadnezzar issues this command for everyone in his province to bow down and worship the golden statue, 90-foot tall golden statue. Well, that's a problem for these guys because they've grown up as good Jews. They've learned the Torah. They've learned the first 5 books of the Bible. In fact, there's a section of it that strictly forbids them to do what they're being commanded to do. In Exodus chapter 20, starting in verse 2, it says, if I can find it in my notes, God says, I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that's in heaven above, on the earth beneath, or in the water under the earth. And you shall not bow down to them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. The first 2 of the 10 commandments, no other gods before me, and do not worship any carved or made images. And here they are being commanded to worship this statue. But it's more than just being commanded to go through the motions of bowing down. What they're being commanded to do is to turn over their allegiance to King Nebuchadnezzar, to change their view of this king, of just a guy who's really powerful, but to surrender their allegiance, to find their peace and security in the kingdom of Babylon. To say, King Nebuchadnezzar, you are the giver of life. You're the one that is sustaining all of us, and we praise you and we thank you for being so benevolent and generous back to us, your subjects. It was more than just bowing down and going through the motions. It was an issue of devotion, which is why they refused. At some point, the music broke out, and everybody around them bowed down and surrendered their allegiance to King Nebuchadnezzar. But not these 3 young men. They were willing to risk their lives. They were willing to be thrown into a fiery furnace because for them, this was about more than just a statue. This had to do with their heart. This had to do with their primary loyalty and allegiance, which is why it's such an important thing for us to ask ourselves, what do I worship? What truly has the allegiance of my heart? What you've got to understand about worship is that it's our response to what we value the most. And it's really hard to find that out because we can be really good at self-deception and just kind of going through the motions. And I know that I'm in a crowd of people who showed up together on a Sunday morning around 10:30, and I know I'm talking to people online who tuned into an online worship gathering. I know who I'm talking to. I know we use the phrase preaching to the choir, but here's what I know about me, and maybe it's true about you as well. What I know about me is that I can be guilty of showing up and going through the motions. Meanwhile, there are things that are grabbing after my heart, and there are other competitors that come in for the devotion of my heart. And if I'm not careful, what I can find is that God's place as the center of my life comes into a fierce competition, because there's so many things that are pulling after us, some good, some not so good. And we have to ask ourselves some really difficult questions like, what does matter the most to me? What do I spend the majority of my time thinking about? What do I spend the majority of my time pursuing? Where is all of my time, my energy, and my money going toward? Because according to God, that's oftentimes where you will find your heart. What is it that really gets me stirred up and fired up? What grabs after the affections of my heart? Oftentimes that becomes the object of our worship. And it's only through taking that difficult time of slowing down, having a quiet moment, and digging into the deep recesses of our hearts that we actually can find what is truly our object of worship. Because if we're not careful, we'll convince ourselves and sometimes deceive ourselves into thinking, well, once a week, I go to this place. And because I go to this place, this is true of my life. And that's not always true. Sometimes that's the greatest lie that Satan will sell us. Worship is our response to what we value the most. That's why it's such an important topic to God. And we have to begin to think about, where in my life could I possibly be setting up these idols? Maybe there's not this pagan shrine set up in your home of something you're bowing down to. But is it possible there are things in your life that have been created and have taken places in your heart and become these little idols that you don't realize, but you're bending over toward and you're bowing down to? I want to share with us 3 concepts that a lot of people find a lot of struggles in. I can find myself struggling with these as well. We could add many to the list. I only have time for 3, and probably am going to take a little too much time to talk about them. The first one is the God of wealth. These are gods that are after our hearts. So Matthew 6:24, Jesus says nobody can serve 2 masters. He will either love the one and hate the other. He'll be devoted to the one and despise the other. Did you catch that word? He'll be devoted. That's a response of worship. It's all in your devotion. And then he says you cannot serve God and mammon. Some translations say money. Some translations say possessions. The original word is a word mammon. And because in modern translations we have no idea what in the world that means, we retranslated it to money. Well, mammon is actually this Babylonian deity that is the god of wealth. And the idea was, if you would just worship mammon and surrender your life to mammon, then you'll get rich. Yeah, it's like we say today, oh, they sold their souls to the devil, and that's how they got rich. It's the same idea. If you'll just surrender your life to mammon, to the God of wealth, then you can get rich. And this is a lie that we buy a lot of times. Think about the number of parables that Jesus told. He told 38 parables. 16 of them deal with money, because God knows that money can become a primary competitor for the devotion of our hearts. And God is very clear that where our treasure is, that's where we will find our heart. And so we have to ask the question, how do I know if wealth or money has become my God? Well, one quick way is, has money become the source of your security? Do you find yourself agonizing over the current stock market, over the flux of cash flow that's coming through your bank account? Do you have this mindset that if I could just get to this level of income, then everything would be okay? If I could just reach this level of possessions, if I could just get this or be able to buy this, then I would be okay. Then I would be secure. If I can just save up this much money, then I'll be set, and I don't have to worry about it ever again. Am I finishing some sentences you've ever had in your mind? Yeah, you're not alone. Me too. And what that reveals, if we're not careful, is that our source of security is no longer the God who provides us with our daily bread, as Jesus told us to pray, but it becomes this account. It becomes this mirage. It becomes this fake idol that promises security, promises to take away all of our worries, but cannot deliver. If that's you, I want to remind you of some words that Paul says in 1 Timothy 6. He said, command those who are rich in this present world. Let's just pause right here. Who is rich in this present world? Okay. I'll give you the answer according to our current world standards. It's not an income level. It's much simpler than that. If there's extra food in your pantry, according to world standards, you are rich. Whether or not you chose to eat it, that's completely up to you. If there's extra food in your pantry, according to our world, you are more than rich. So if that describes you, I want you to perk up and listen to the words of Paul. It's very convicting and challenging. He said, command those who are rich in this present age not to be arrogant and not to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. By doing so, you will lay up for yourselves a treasure, which is a firm foundation for the coming age, so that you may take hold of the life. Catch this now, I love this line. So that you can take hold of the life that is truly life. I love that. I love that Paul points out, if you truly want to live. It's not found in an income level. It's found in a perspective on whatever it is that God has blessed you with. The life that is truly life is something that only God can give to us. This false god of wealth just simply gives us a lie in thinking that it provides security to us, when in reality, it's removed our treasure from heaven and placed it here. And by removing our treasure from heaven and placed it here, we have, in result, placed our heart here instead of in God himself. That's the first God that we're tempted to worship. The second one is in the God of power and influence. Now here's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they're being commanded to bow down and worship this image. Now, I'm going to assume that none of you have built a 90-foot tall golden statue of yourself. If you did, come talk to me later. We've got some things to work through. But I'm going to assume that that's not you. But has this ever happened to you? Or have you ever heard somebody say this? Or maybe they've even said it about you. Has there ever been a time where those that you live with and love dearly have to walk on eggshells because they're afraid that you're in a bad mood and they're going to kind of set you off? Has there ever been a situation where you've been, whether you're the boss or the employee, where boss comes in and boss is in a bad mood, and everybody be careful, because when the boss is in a bad mood, everybody else has a bad day. What have we done? We've caused the world to revolve around this one individual. Has there ever been a situation where if you're in a position of influence, whether like teaching or coaching or anything like that, that your students or your players are worried about whether or not you're going to go off on them because they got something wrong? It's a challenge for all of us, because pride will get into the hearts of every one of us. Let me just tell you a personal story. For the last 14 years or so, I've had the privilege of coaching basketball in some capacity. I've coached all the way down 7-year-olds all the way up through juniors and seniors in high school, and I love it. Now, early in my coaching career, I thought that coaching meant be mean. That's what I had seen in coaches in my life and coaches on TV. I thought it just meant yell. And when your players don't do good, just demand perfection, yell at them, make them run, and they'll make it right. And that was my mentality. And so here I am coaching middle schoolers a lot. And then moved over to the middle school girls program. Now, my girls were really young at the time. I had been working with teenagers for several years, but I did not, and still do not, understand the mind of a 13 and 14-year-old young lady. And here I am trying to impart to them the knowledge of the game of basketball. But I don't know anything about coaching, and so I just did what I had seen before. I decided to be mean. And thank the Lord, there was a mentor in the faith, the dad of one of my players, who called me and said, "Hey, can we go to breakfast on Saturday?" "Yeah, sure." And we sat down. I said, "What's on your mind?" He lovingly, and in a way that only he could have done, told me how ridiculous I was being. He was a lot nicer than that, but that's what he did. He looked at me and basically told me that I was making it where his daughter did not want to play the game of basketball anymore. The game. You know, when you play a game, it's supposed to be fun. Of course, we joke in our household, you know what's fun? Winning. But I was taking what was supposed to be fun and not making it fun anymore. And boy, that hit me like a ton of bricks. I had to go back to the drawing board. And what I realized is that any level of influence can corrupt a heart. Yes, you can become prideful coaching middle school girls basketball. Satan will use anything to destroy your ego. How did Jesus wield power and influence? Well, he grabbed a towel and a bowl of water and washed feet. He allowed Roman soldiers to hang him on a cross for you and I to find salvation. He taught those who would follow him not to seek power and authority, but to use it as an opportunity to bless other people. Instead of trying to be first in everything, learn to come in last and to serve others along the way. So how can we keep power and influence from corrupting our hearts? Well, according to Paul in Philippians 2, we need to have the mindset, the attitude of Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not consider equality with God, this position of power and prestige, something to be grasped and something to be held on to, like it's mine and I got to hold on to it. But instead, he allowed himself to be humbled. He lowered himself. Paul said he emptied himself, taking on the form of a human being, and came to this earth and lived as a human being and went to the ultimate extreme in obedience to God by becoming a sacrificial death on that cross. He became that lamb for you and I. That's how Jesus wielded power and influence. The one who John said at the beginning hung on a cross. That's what he calls us to do. But boy, that God of power and influence is after our hearts. Here's the third one. It's the God of pleasure. Every civilization has had a different form of the God of pleasure. We see it today. If you want to find the God of pleasure being worshiped, just turn on TV, turn on the radio to current music, find your favorite streaming service, because pleasure sells, does it not? You realize that the largest industry in the United States of America is pornography. You realize that the largest industry that nobody wants to talk about, one of the largest industries that nobody wants to talk about, is human and child trafficking. You do recognize that for the next 15 months, the issue that's going to be on the table as we come into another presidential election is going to be abortion. It's going to be hotly debated. It's going to be the primary issue. Why? Because we need to be able to make it as a civilization where you can do whatever you want to do without any kind of consequences whatsoever. Because we have sold fully and bought fully into, as a civilization, into the idea of instant gratification. Pleasure sells. And if we're honest, we can find that in our own life too, where we battle this idea of instant gratification. But what we don't always realize is that what this God of pleasure is promising to us can never deliver. It's one of the greatest bait and switches of all time. What we're promised is never delivered. We think that by instant gratification, we're going to receive this deeper level of intimacy when in reality, we're just being alone and separated. We think that we're going to find this deeper level of satisfaction when in reality, we're just simply enslaved to something else. It's like those of you that love to fish, it's like a really nice lure. You know, it's real shiny. It looks completely real. And for that fish, it looks very enticing and filling. But once you bite hold, there's a hook that's hidden inside of it that you never knew was there. And when you give in to the God of pleasure, now you're on the hook. And once you're on the hook, it's so hard to get off of the hook. It's not impossible because God is way more powerful than any type of addictive behavior. Think about it like this. Paul told us to put to death our fleshly desires. Jesus said that the beginning of following him, he said, if you want to follow me, it first starts with denying yourself. And then you take what Paul wrote in Galatians chapter 5 when he's describing the fruit of the Spirit, and he says that the final fruit, as he goes down this list that are lining the walls of our auditorium, as he goes down this list, the final fruit to see that the Holy Spirit is leading your life and that you're maturing as a believer, are you ready? The final fruit, the final sign, is self-control. Now tell me this, is there any area of your life where you're like, no, I don't need any more self-control. Totally mastered it. Good to go there. Think about the areas of your life where having more self-control would benefit you. Could you use more self-control in your emotions? You don't have to nod your head. I know how you are in your heart. Could you use more self-control in your relationships? Could you use more self-control when you go to work and in your reactions and in the ways that your heart gets thrown around? Could you use more self-control, those of us that are married, in your marriage, or those of us that are raising kids? Could you be more self-controlled in your parenting? Teenagers, could you use more self-control in your friendships and in the ways that our society is after you to distract you? Could you use more self-control in your spiritual life? You see, self-control is just learning to say no to self in order to say yes to God. It's simply learning to say no to right now in order to say yes to heaven. But even though it's simply saying that, you know as well as I do, it's not simple to do. It's a constant battle of recognizing that what the God of pleasure is selling is just fake goods, cannot fully satisfy. So I want to leave you with 3 questions this morning to help us answer this question of what am I worshiping? And is the object of my devotion the right object? Can it truly give me what I need? So here's the first question. Is what you worship what you really want to become? I love this line from Ralph Waldo Emerson. Said a person will worship something, have no doubt about that. We may think that our tribute is paid in secret in the dark recesses of our hearts, but it will come out. That which dominates our imaginations and our thoughts will determine our lives and our character, and it behooves us. Isn't that an awesome word? It behooves us to be careful with worship. We are becoming. Scripture echoes that thought. Psalm 115:8 says, those who make idols become like them. So if money is your idol, you'll become greedy. If work is your idol, you'll become a workaholic. If family is your idol, you'll become overprotective. If pleasure is your idol, you'll become self-obsessed and completely out of control. You will become like what you worship. However, if God is the greatest devotion of your heart, if you have no other gods but Him, then what you'll become, according to Paul, is you'll become love and joyful and kind, patient and gentle, self-controlled. That's who you'll become. Are you becoming the kind of person you really want to be? If not, then you might check your object of worship. Here's the second one. Does what you worship truly satisfy your deepest needs? Have you ever bought the lie that buying that new thing, the house, the car, the phone, whatever it was going to truly satisfy you? Oh, once I get that, I'm going to be good. Boy, I've uttered that 1,000 times. And it lasts for a little while, right? A little while. It's like a donut. It'll fill you up for a little bit, but it's not really nutrient dense, and so it leaves you hungry after a while. And that's what finding satisfaction in anything other than God will leave us feeling like. If I could just get the promotion, if I could just get into this school, if I could just make this much money, if I could just find the right person, then I'd be satisfied. Did you pay attention to the words that Mason read to us? I want to pick up in verse 3 of Psalm 63. Because your love is better than life, my lips will glorify you. I will praise you as long as I live. In your name I will lift up my hands. I will be fully satisfied as with the richest of foods. With singing lips my mouth will praise you. According to the psalmist, the only thing that can satisfy is God Himself. It's probably time for another C.S. Lewis quote. It's been a little while, so here's one for you. I've shared it before and I'll share it again. C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity wrote, if I find within myself desires which this world cannot satisfy, then the only logical conclusion is that I was made for another world. This world cannot satisfy. Only God can. Here's the third and final question. Does what you worship deliver you from your greatest problems? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego made a profound statement of faith. They said, our God whom we serve, that's another way of saying who we worship, is able to deliver us from this fire. Is your God able to deliver you from the fire, whatever it is that you're worshiping? Because let me tell you that power and money and influence and pleasure cannot deliver you from your greatest problems. They will not make your relationships better. They will not make your self-esteem better. They will not deliver you from any of the problems that you're enduring in life. They will simply complicate them more. And they certainly cannot deliver you from your greatest problem, which is your sin problem and your impending death. Only God can deliver us from that. And how did He deliver us from our greatest problem? He sent His Son into this world, as Eric talked about and read from Isaiah 53, where Jesus became that ultimate sacrifice who willingly gave His life on the cross. And then there's this promise in Scripture that those who will receive that offer of salvation, those who will place their hope and trust in God, those who will allow God to wash their sins away through baptism, and those who will continue from then on to live a life of worship, that we received this promise through God's Spirit being placed within us, that one day, even though our life on this earth will come to an end, our eternal future will simply just begin as we await that moment when Jesus returns and all of the dead are raised and we live with the Lord forever. That's the promise that we have. No other object of worship other than God Himself can deliver us from our greatest problem of sin and death. I read over the last couple of weeks a line that's really stuck with me. It said that the Christian life can be distilled down to this: what are you going to worship? It's a decision that you'll make today, tomorrow, and every day God places you on this earth. The challenge that I want to give you this morning, number one, is to consider, what are you worshiping? And number two, just because in just a couple of minutes we're going to have what we call the, quote, closing prayer, my challenge to you is not to close your worship this week. Because you're only lying to yourself if you think that because a prayer has been prayed and someone has said amen, that your worship for the week is over. If that's your mindset, that means you're walking out the door to worship something else. But if your desire is to worship God in everything that you do, in your entire being, then whenever life takes you tomorrow, whatever you go to do, it's an opportunity to give God praise. It's an opportunity to glorify Him through your work, through your school, through your relationships, through your kindness, through your patience. Because we all worship, and we all worship all the time. This morning, if you're here and you need to repent of allowing something else to come into your heart that's taken that primary place of devotion, we're going to sing a song in just a minute. And if you want us to pray for you, our shepherds will be up front and in the back. We'd love to do that. If you want to place Jesus at the center of your life and be baptized into Christ today, we'd love to celebrate that with you. Watching you put on Christ in baptism as you begin this life of glorifying Him. The song that we're going to sing is not a traditional invitation song. It's a worship song. So wherever you are, as you're standing there, I just pray that as we sing this together, that it will recenter your heart back onto Jesus as you make a declaration of praise that He and He alone is the only one worthy of your worship. Let's stand together and sing.